Lone Pine, California, April 7th, 1977. This tape will be called The Two Supreme Virtues. There are two types of relationship with which man is confronted. These are, first, the relationship to the vertical component, and second, his relationship to the horizontal component. By the vertical component, I mean all relationships to that which is above and below man. And by the relationships to the horizontal component, I mean the relationship between man and his brothers, the other creatures who are developing on essentially the same level on which he is developing. Thus, bear in mind, we have two prime factors in our orientation. The upward portion of the vertical component reaches toward that which we variously call the metaphysical, the transcendent, the superconscient, or by any name that we give to the divinity. The downward portion of this vertical component leads to the shadow world below, to that which ultimately we call the satanic or the infernal, or also the subconscious. In a generalized sense, the upward portion of the vertical component includes, beside the ultimate supernal, all those entities or states which transcend the level of our present consciousness. Thus, any entities that have evolved beyond man, the so-called X-Men or Dion Jones, would be attained by ascension in the vertical component. Likewise, in a generalized sense, the downward portion of the vertical component would include all those entities or states that are below the level occupied by man, such as the animals, the vegetables, the minerals, and any other lesser entities that there may be. The prime pure orientation is either to the supernal or the infernal. The horizontal component is the relationship to all entities or states of consciousness that are on a level comparable with that which man has currently attained. There are two possible relationships he may have towards these entities. One is that of compassion, and the other is that of incompassion or hostility. all actions that are of a friendly sort towards entities on approximately the same level, which aims at the good of those entities, we will call an attitude of compassion. Those relationships that are seeking to bring about injury of creatures on the same level, like the relationship of war, of aggression, of criminality, of hostility of all sorts, we will classify as incompassion. We shall next attempt a definition of our two qualities, purity and compassion. Because it is a little easier to define the latter, we will proceed first with the definition of compassion. As I conceive it, for the purposes of this discussion, compassion is given a rather broader meaning than usually is given to it. Ordinarily, compassion is conceived as a relationship of bestowal from a superior to some entity or entities less evolved. But I shall give to it here the combined meaning of brotherhood and benignity. The brotherhood relationship is clearly a horizontal relationship, a relationship between those who stand closely related to the same level of development. Benignity is an attitude of well-meaning, of giving good or good intent to creatures. And while this is part of the meaning of compassion and is partly defined as compassion, it is also a quality of purity. From the experience and imperience of the transformation cycle of 1936, I can give a report of some of the meaning of ascension into the states of purity. At one time in that ascension, without realizing what was happening, and quite inadvertently, I found myself in a state of purity so high and so pure that it was almost impossible to return out of it. It was as though the ascending individual came into a zone where the force of levitation was stronger than the force of gravity. In other words, one was in the position analogous to that of an individual who was tied to a balloon filled with a light gas, which would cause him to ascend. The ascending power of the light gas was greater than the attracting power of gravity toward the earth. And the problem would be analogous to that of this individual if he sought to return to earth. So long as he was attached to the balloon containing light gas, it would be difficult for him to make a return to the earth. There is some level of consciousness where one has an experience of this sort. I found it difficult and at one time questionable as to whether I could return downward. Somehow I managed to do so. And in fact, to stay within the field of this consciousness in this world, I found it calls for a certain placing into one's nature deliberately of certain impurities in order to prevent ascension away from this field of consciousness. You might say that it requires the placing of something like lead in the shoes in order to stay down, as is necessary in the case of divers into certain depths of the ocean. Neither at the time of that experience or experience, nor since, have I found any reference in literature concerning this kind of state. It may possibly be that if one follows the discipline of the Kuan Yin vow over a protracted period before an illuminating experience, that it has the effect of placing lead in one's shoes. But in any case, I wish to emphasize this point. One may reach a lofty state and resolve to follow the course given in the voice of the silence, namely to return, in order to make of himself a channel or the current which flows from Sumeru, so that it may be rendered available to suffering mankind. Yet find that it's well nigh impossible to complete this determination and execute it. This is an important point and something to be kept in mind. As I know it, when one ascends above a certain point, it is not a question of one struggling to purify himself, but on the contrary, there are surrounding him powers or forces which affect progressively his purification autonomously. One becomes pure despite himself and not simply because he has striven to overcome the action of impurity. And this I know, that the higher one rises in consciousness, the more attractive it becomes. One would gladly ascend and never return. Everything is so utterly fine and sweet and rich. The consciousness so far transcends everything this world can offer that one realizes that life in this world is really life in a kind of hell, which draws him to it not at all. The determination to return may be present in an individual because he believes in the way of compassion. But the attraction that may have been in this world for him in an earlier day is broken, and the supernal pulls with an all-commanding force as one participates in this highest zone. There is a strong sense that he's returning home, that his sojourn in this outer world has been a life in an alien field, that the values here are cheap and often sordid, and that he is here an exile from that zone where he properly belongs. This is a powerful experience. It is the greatest thing that can come into any individual's consciousness.